The restaurant was glowing with golden lights as evening settled over the city. The glass windows reflected the soft jazz playing in the background, and waiters in crisp white shirts moved quickly between tables, balancing trays filled with dishes too expensive for most people to pronounce. Among them was a young waitress quietly making her way through the crowd. She was dressed like the others in the same uniform, but there was something about her eyes, calm, watchful, as if she was always listening to something only she could hear. Her job was simple: serve the guests, keep a smile, and make sure nothing went wrong. But the restaurant wasn't just a place where people came to eat. It was where the city's elite gathered: the business owners, the politicians, the actors who were used to being admired. For her, it was just another shift, another long night of walking between tables, remembering orders, and pretending not to notice the tired ache in her feet. The piano stood in the corner near the big window. It was an elegant black grand piano shining under the chandelier. Every evening, a professional pianist played soft music while the guests dined. Those melodies filled the air, wrapping the whole place in an air of luxury and grace. For the waitress, it was more than background music. Every note reminded her of a life she once dreamed of, a life that now seemed far away. She used to play too. Not in fancy restaurants or before well-dressed people, but in a small house where music was more about love than luxury. Her grandfather had been her first teacher. He would sit beside her, guiding her fingers on the keys, teaching her not just how to play but how to feel the music. Those were the happiest days of her life. But things changed fast. Her grandfather passed away, and with him went the little world of melodies and dreams they had built together. After his death, money became tight. Her family had bills to pay, and music couldn't feed them. She stopped playing, packed her old music sheets into a box, and left her small town to find work. The restaurant job came by chance. At first, she thought it would be temporary, just a few months until she found something better. But months turned into years, and her dream of playing again grew quieter with every passing day. Still, she never completely let it go. Every time she wiped a table near the piano, her fingers itched to touch the keys again. Sometimes, when no one was watching, she'd pause just for a second and imagine what it would feel like to play once more. But then someone would call her name and she'd snap back to reality. A waitress in a world where people like her were meant to serve, not perform. That evening was busy, busier than usual. A famous businessman had reserved the largest table for an important gathering. The staff had been preparing since morning, polishing glasses, arranging flowers, and double-checking every detail. The manager was on edge, walking around with a frown, making sure everything was perfect. The young waitress kept her focus, moving quietly between tasks. She knew the manager didn't like mistakes, and tonight, of all nights, there was no room for any. When the guests started arriving, the room filled with laughter and conversation. The air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh food. Cameras flashed as a few reporters came in to cover the event. It was one of those nights that made everyone nervous but also proud to be working there. The pianist sat down at his usual spot and began to play. The soft notes of a classical tune floated through the room, blending perfectly with the clinking of glasses and the hum of conversation. As she passed by the piano carrying a tray, she slowed down for just a moment. The sound wrapped around her like an old memory. Her eyes softened, and for a few seconds the noise of the restaurant faded away. She wasn't in that crowded room anymore. In her mind, she was back in her grandfather's living room, sitting on the old wooden bench beside him. She could almost hear his voice saying, "Feel the music, not just the keys." But the spell broke as someone called her name. She blinked, straightened up, and hurried toward the kitchen. Inside, the heat and noise hit her like a wave. The cooks were shouting orders, pans were clattering, and the smell of grilled meat filled the air. She placed the empty tray on the counter and grabbed the next one. Her co-worker, an older waiter with a kind smile, noticed the faraway look on her face. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded quickly. "Yeah, just tired," he smiled knowingly. "Long night. But hey, at least the music's nice, huh?" She smiled faintly. "Yeah, it's beautiful." He didn't know that every note made her heart ache a little. It was like hearing someone else live the life she once wanted. As the night went on, she stayed busy. Table after table, smile after smile. She barely had time to think. But every now and then her eyes would drift to the piano. The pianist played effortlessly, his hands moving across the keys like water. The guests clapped softly after each song, barely noticing him beyond his music. She thought about how strange it was to be surrounded by beauty and still feel invisible. During a short break, she stood by the window, watching the city lights. Cars passed below, their headlights flashing like stars. Somewhere out there, she thought, people were chasing dreams, making things happen. But she was here, refilling glasses and clearing plates. Yet even in that quiet moment, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet. A sudden noise pulled her attention back. One of the waiters dropped a tray and the sound of breaking glass echoed across the restaurant. The manager rushed over, scolding him in a low but angry voice. Everyone pretended not to look, but they all felt the tension. The young waitress quickly stepped in to help clean up, crouching down to pick the broken pieces. The manager gave her a brief nod of approval. He wasn't unkind, just strict, always worried about the restaurant's reputation. When she stood up again, her eyes met the pianist's for a brief second. He gave her a small, polite smile before looking back at the keys. It was a fleeting moment, but it reminded her of something. That music connected people, even strangers, in ways words never could. As the evening neared its end, she felt exhaustion weighing on her legs. Still, she didn't complain. She took a deep breath and carried on, clearing tables and thanking guests as they left. But inside, she felt a strange pull toward the piano. When the last group of guests finally left and the staff began cleaning up, she lingered near it. The pianist had already gone, leaving the cover half open. The dim light from the chandelier reflected off the black surface. It was quiet now, almost peaceful. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out and touched the keys. Just one note, then another. The sound was soft, but it filled the empty room beautifully. She smiled, her eyes shining for the first time that night. For those few seconds, she forgot everything. The long shifts, the tired feet, the life that felt stuck. All that mattered was the sound of those keys and the memory of her grandfather's voice. She didn't know the head waiter had come back in to grab something he forgot. He stopped at the doorway, watching quietly. He didn't interrupt. There was something so pure in the way she played, even though it was just a few notes. When she noticed him, she pulled her hand back quickly, embarrassed. "Sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have." He shook his head gently. "No, it's okay. You play really well." Her cheeks turned slightly red. "It's been a long time." "You should play more," he said softly. "It suits you." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Not here. This isn't the kind of place where waitresses play pianos." He didn't argue. He just gave a small smile and walked away. But his words stayed with her. Maybe it didn't matter what kind of place it was. Maybe dreams didn't need permission. That night when she got home, she sat by her small window and looked at the moon. The city outside was still alive, horns, lights, laughter. She thought about how her grandfather used to say that music was a language that never died. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was still inside her, waiting for the right moment to speak again. As she drifted to sleep, she didn't know that moment would come sooner than she thought. And when it did, it would change everything. But for now, all she could do was dream, holding on to the faint echo of piano keys that still lingered in her heart. The next morning, the sun peeked through her thin curtains and the sound of traffic filled the air. She woke up to the familiar hum of the city outside her small apartment. The walls were bare, except for a few photos of her family and an old picture of her grandfather sitting beside the piano. She rubbed her eyes, still feeling the exhaustion from last night. But there was something else lingering too. A quiet warmth from the few moments she spent playing those piano keys after everyone had gone home. As she got ready for work, she found herself humming a tune. It wasn't something she planned. It just came out naturally, like her heart was singing before her mind could stop it. She paused for a second, surprised at herself, then smiled faintly. It had been years since she'd allowed music to live freely inside her like that. Her apartment was tiny, a single room with a small stove, a bed, and a window that overlooked the street. It wasn't much, but it was home. She made a cup of instant coffee and sat by the window, watching people rush to work. For most of them, life seemed like a race. For her, it was more like a quiet walk, one day blending into the next. But something about last night kept replaying in her mind. The way her fingers had remembered every key, how it felt like she was talking to her grandfather. Her co-worker, the same older waiter who had spoken to her last night, greeted her with a smile. "Morning. Long night, huh?" She nodded. "Yeah, but it went well," he chuckled. "You did great, like always." The guests seemed happy. And hey, I saw you near the piano after closing. Didn't know you could play. Her face turned a little pink. I used to a long time ago. Used to. You should still play. You've got something special there, he said kindly. She smiled softly but didn't answer. It was easier to bury that part of her life than to explain everything. The loss, the struggle, the dreams she had packed away in that old box under her bed. As the day went on, she couldn't help but glance at the piano every time she passed it. The pianist was there again, playing softly, his hands gliding over the keys with grace. He noticed her looking once and gave her a small nod. She smiled politely and went back to work, but her heart fluttered for reasons she didn't quite understand. It wasn't admiration for the pianist himself, but for what he represented, a life filled with music, something she used to have. During her lunch break, she sat at a small table near the back of the restaurant eating quietly. The sound of the piano filled the room again, and for a moment it made her forget she was just an employee. It made her remember what it felt like to dream. One of her younger co-workers, curious, joined her. "Hey, I heard you can play piano too. Is that true?" she asked, grinning. The waitress blinked, surprised.
"Who told you that?"
"Everyone's talking about it. Apparently you played a few notes last night after closing and it sounded amazing." She laughed softly. "It was nothing, really. Nothing, please. I can't even play one note without scaring people away. You should play sometime when everyone's here. I bet you'd blow them away." The thought made her nervous. The idea of playing in front of people again after all these years felt impossible. "I don't think so," she said, shaking her head. "It's been too long. I'd just embarrass myself." Her coworker shrugged, still smiling. "Maybe. Or maybe you'd surprise yourself." The conversation ended there, but her words stuck in her mind. Maybe you'd surprise yourself. She didn't know why, but she couldn't stop thinking about it all afternoon. Later that evening, when the restaurant got busy again, the familiar rhythm of work took over. The sound of plates, glasses, and chatter filled the space. She moved gracefully through it all, almost like a dancer on a stage she didn't choose but learned to master. She had grown used to watching others shine while she stayed in the background. But deep down, a small part of her was starting to wake up, a part that missed being seen for something more than her service. That night, after the last guest left, she helped clean up again. The manager was in a good mood for once. He was talking about an upcoming charity dinner that would bring even more famous guests. Everyone was excited but nervous too. The restaurant would have to be perfect. "The music has to be exceptional that night," the manager said, glancing at the piano. "People expect a certain level when they come here. We can't afford any mistakes." The waitress listened quietly, wiping a table nearby. The pianist nodded, assuring him everything would be fine. But as she listened, a tiny thought crossed her mind. What if she could play that night? The idea made her heart race. She quickly shook her head. It was crazy. She was a waitress, not a performer. No one would take her seriously. Still, the thought refused to leave. When she got home that night, she couldn't sleep. The idea of playing again kept her awake. She got up and opened the old box under her bed. Inside were her grandfather's music sheets, yellowed with time but still neatly folded. Her fingers trembled as she picked one up. The notes looked like old friends she hadn't seen in years. She placed the sheet on her small table and traced the lines, remembering how her grandfather used to guide her hand. She didn't have a piano anymore, but she pretended. She tapped the notes softly on the table, imagining the keys beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes and could almost hear the sound, gentle, familiar, full of emotion. It brought back memories of her childhood home, the smell of tea, the warmth of laughter. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she smiled through them. For the first time in a long while, she felt connected to something real. The next few days went by quickly. Work stayed busy, but she found herself paying more attention to the piano. Sometimes when the pianist took a break, she would walk by and look at the keys, her heart aching to touch them again. One afternoon, when no one was around, she finally gave in. She sat down and played a few soft notes. Her hands were a bit stiff, but the melody came back naturally, like it had been waiting all this time. She didn't notice that the pianist had walked in quietly behind her. When she stopped embarrassed, he smiled kindly. "You play beautifully," he said. She stood quickly. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't. No need to apologize." "That was wonderful. Where did you learn?" She hesitated. My grandfather taught me when I was a kid. He must have been proud, the pianist said softly. You have a real gift, she smiled shyly. It's been years since I played seriously. You should start again, he said. Music like that doesn't fade. It just waits for you to come back. His words stayed with her long after he left. Maybe he was right. Maybe it wasn't too late to start again. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about the upcoming charity event. What if something went wrong? What if the pianist couldn't make it? The thought scared her, but it also made her heart beat faster. Maybe fate would give her one more chance, a moment to remind the world and herself who she really was. As she walked home, the streets were quiet. A light drizzle had started, and she didn't bother with her umbrella. The cool air felt good against her face. She passed a small cafe where a young man was playing guitar by the window. A few people clapped softly when he finished. She stopped to watch for a moment. There was something beautiful about it. The courage to perform, to share a piece of your soul with strangers. Maybe she could do that too, just once. When she got home, she sat at her table again and practiced in silence, her fingers tapping out invisible notes on the wood. She imagined the sound, the rhythm, the emotion. Her heart raced as if she could already feel the weight of that moment. The spotlight, the quiet crowd, the first touch of the keys. In that small apartment, under the dim glow of a single lamp, she promised herself something. If the chance ever came, she wouldn't run from it. She would play again, not for fame, not for applause, but for her grandfather, for the little girl she once was, and for the part of her that refused to give up. What she didn't know was that fate was already preparing that chance, and when it came, it would take her from the quiet corners of the restaurant to the center of a moment that no one in that room would ever forget. The week of the charity dinner arrived, and the restaurant was buzzing with nervous energy. Everyone wanted everything to be perfect. The tables were dressed in white linen, silverware polished until it gleamed, and fresh flowers placed at every corner. The manager was more serious than usual, giving sharp instructions and reminding everyone that the event would be filled with important guests. For the young waitress, it was just another shift on the outside, but inside, she felt something different. A strange mix of excitement and fear that she couldn't quite explain. For days, she had been practicing in secret. Late at night, after finishing her shift, she would stay behind for a few minutes when the restaurant was empty. The pianist had kindly allowed her to play sometimes after closing, saying it was good to see someone so passionate about music. She didn't play for anyone else. It was just her and the piano, the way it used to be when she was a child. Every night, her fingers moved more freely and the music began to sound like it used to, alive and full of feeling. But she never told anyone about it. The idea of playing in front of others, especially such an elite crowd, felt impossible. Still, a small voice inside her whispered that maybe, one day, she would get the chance. The night before the big event, she stayed late again. The lights were dim, the chairs stacked, and the air smelled faintly of candles and polish. She sat at the piano, her reflection faintly visible on its black surface. Her hands hovered over the keys, hesitant. Then she began to play. It was a soft, gentle tune that her grandfather had taught her. Every note carried a memory, his laughter, his patience, his belief in her. By the time she finished, she had tears in her eyes. But they weren't sad tears. They were full of warmth, as if he was still there, watching her, proud. The next morning, she woke up early. The air was cold, and the sky outside her window was gray. She felt nervous for reasons she couldn't explain. Maybe it was because the restaurant had been talking about the dinner nonstop for a week. The guest list was full of powerful names, people whose faces appeared in magazines and on TV. She knew her role was simple: serve the food, stay quiet, and make sure everything went smoothly. But a small part of her hoped something different might happen. By evening, the restaurant looked completely transformed. Chandeliers sparkled brighter than usual, and the air smelled of roses and perfume. The staff moved quickly but carefully, checking every little detail. The pianist arrived early to warm up, playing a few light notes to test the sound. The young waitress walked by quietly, pretending not to listen, though every sound seemed to pull her closer. The guests began arriving one by one, their laughter and greetings filling the room. The flash of cameras reflected off the glass windows. The manager stood near the entrance, greeting them with a practiced smile. The waitress moved through the tables, serving drinks, adjusting napkins, doing her job perfectly. But her eyes kept finding their way to the piano. Each time she looked, her heart beat a little faster. Everything was going smoothly until suddenly, the pianist stopped playing mid-song. The music faded and people looked around, confused. The pianist stood, holding his wrist with a wince. The manager rushed over. After a quick exchange, it became clear. He had hurt his hand earlier in the day and the pain had suddenly worsened. He couldn't continue. A ripple of concern went through the staff. The manager's face turned pale. The music was supposed to last the entire evening. Without it, the atmosphere would feel empty and the guests would notice. He looked around helplessly, trying to think of a solution. The pianist apologized again, saying he couldn't risk making it worse. The waitress stood at the edge of the room, frozen. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. The manager began to panic quietly, calling a few people to see if any replacement musicians were available. But it was too late. The guests were already seated and the show had to go on. Then, before she could stop herself, she took a step forward. Her voice came out quietly at first. "I can play." Everyone turned toward her. The noise of the room seemed to fade. The manager blinked in surprise. "What did you say?" She swallowed hard, her palms sweating. "I can play the piano. If you need someone, I can do it." The room went silent for a moment. Some of the staff exchanged doubtful glances. The guests who overheard chuckled softly, assuming it was a joke. But the manager was desperate. He looked at her for a long second, then sighed. "Are you sure?" She nodded, though her legs were trembling. "Yes, I can do it." The manager hesitated, then finally said, "All right. Try something, but keep it simple." She took a deep breath and walked slowly toward the piano. Every step felt heavier than the last. She could feel dozens of eyes following her. Some of the guests whispered to each other, clearly wondering what a waitress was doing. Her hands shook as she sat down. The soft light above reflected off the polished surface. For a moment, she just sat there, staring at the keys, trying to steady her breathing. Then she remembered her grandfather's voice in her mind, calm and gentle, saying, "Don't play for them. Play for yourself." Her fingers touched the keys and the first note rang out. It was soft, almost hesitant, but clear. Then another and another. Slowly, the melody began to take shape. The room grew still. The chatter faded away. The guests turned to watch as the waitress they barely noticed before played with such quiet grace that even the waiters stopped to listen. The song grew stronger, filled with emotion. Her hands no longer trembled. They danced across the piano like they had done 100 times in her childhood. The music told her story. The loss, the struggle, the long years of silence, and the rediscovery of something she thought she had lost forever. Every note was honest, pure, and full of heart. The people in the room were mesmerized. The elite crowd, used to perfection and performance, sat in silence, watching a simple waitress pour her soul into the piano. The melody flowed like a river, sometimes soft, sometimes powerful, touching something deep in everyone who listened. Even the manager, standing at the back, felt a lump rise in his throat. When the final note lingered in the air and faded, there was complete silence for a moment. Then slowly one person began to clap. Another joined. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause. The sound filled the restaurant, louder than any music had before. People stood up, clapping, cheering, even calling out for more. The young waitress sat frozen for a second, her heart racing. She had expected silence, maybe even laughter. Instead, she was looking at a crowd of people who were genuinely moved. Her eyes filled with tears as she stood and gave a small bow. The manager came forward, smiling in disbelief. "That was incredible," he whispered. She smiled shyly. "Thank you." One of the guests, a well-dressed woman seated near the front, approached her. "That was beautiful. Who taught you to play like that?" She hesitated, her voice soft but steady. "My grandfather." The woman nodded, smiling warmly. "He must have been a wonderful teacher." The manager quickly told the guests that the young woman worked at the restaurant. That only made their applause louder. Many couldn't believe that someone who served their food could play with such skill and emotion. A few people began taking videos, wanting to capture the moment. The rest of the evening passed like a dream. The manager allowed her to continue playing, and she did. Song after song, her music filling every corner of the restaurant. The guests stayed longer than usual, listening, smiling, and talking about her talent. When the night finally ended and the last person left, She sat quietly at the piano again, her hands still trembling from excitement. The manager came over and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did something special tonight," he said. "You didn't just save the event, you gave everyone something to remember." She looked up, her eyes shining. "Thank you for letting me play," he smiled. "No, thank you. You reminded us that real talent doesn't need fancy introductions. It just needs courage." When she finally left the restaurant, the city lights seemed brighter. The cool night air felt fresh on her skin. She walked slowly, replaying everything in her mind, the fear, the music, the applause. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like just a waitress. She felt like herself again, a musician, a dreamer, a believer. At home, she sat by the window and looked at the stars. Somewhere, she hoped her grandfather was smiling. The piano keys had brought her back to life, and she knew this was only the beginning. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she was ready to face it. Because now she had her music again, and no one could take that away. The restaurant was filled with the sound of soft chatter, the clinking of glasses and the rustle of expensive fabrics. People dressed in suits and elegant gowns sat around tables covered in white cloths, sipping wine and talking about business, art, and travel. The golden light from the chandeliers reflected on the polished marble floor, adding a warm glow to the place. It looked perfect, but behind the scenes the staff were rushing from one end to the other, trying to keep everything running smoothly. The young waitress moved quickly, balancing trays with practiced ease. She had been working since morning, her feet aching, but she kept her usual calm smile. Tonight was a big night, a charity dinner for one of the wealthiest families in the city. Every guest in that room was someone important. For the staff, it was a night to be perfect, because one small mistake could mean trouble. Usually, there was a pianist who played soft melodies through the evening. His music helped create the atmosphere that everyone admired. But tonight, just an hour before the event started, the manager received a call. The pianist had fallen sick and couldn't come. At first, no one thought it was a big deal. They assumed the restaurant could just play recorded music. But the family hosting the dinner made it clear. They wanted live piano. It was part of the experience they were paying for. The manager's face turned pale. He tried calling a few other pianists in the city, but none were available on such short notice. The air in the staff room grew heavy with tension. The waiters exchanged worried looks. The manager ran his hand through his hair, muttering to himself. Then his eyes landed on the waitress, who was quietly polishing a set of glasses in the corner. "You said you know music, right?" he asked suddenly. She froze, her hand still for a moment. "A little," she said softly. "I used to play," he frowned. "Used to? Can you play something decent? These people expect class, not noise." She hesitated. "I haven't played in a long time." The manager sighed. "Forget it," he said, pacing back and forth. "We'll just tell them the pianist couldn't make it." She looked at the grand piano in the corner of the dining hall, its black surface shining under the warm lights. Her heart started to beat faster. For years, she had only dreamed of playing again. Every night, she wiped that very piano, wishing she could touch those keys. And now, here was a moment she never expected, a chance even if it scared her. Quietly, she spoke again. "Sir, I can try." The manager stopped. "You? You think you can play in front of this crowd?" "I can try," she repeated, her voice firm this time. He stared at her, unsure. But time was running out and he had no other choice. "Fine," he said. "If you embarrass us, it's on you. Play something soft, something elegant. Don't make it dramatic, just fill the silence." When she nodded, he turned away, muttering about how strange the night had become. A few minutes later, as the first course was being served, she walked slowly toward the piano. Some guests noticed her and whispered among themselves. It wasn't common for a waitress to walk up to the piano. Most of them assumed she was just dusting it or adjusting something. She could feel their eyes on her as she sat down on the bench. Her hands trembled slightly. The room was large, and suddenly every sound, every movement seemed magnified. She closed her eyes for a second. In her mind, she saw her grandfather's small house. She saw herself sitting beside him, learning how to play her first song. She remembered how his wrinkled hands guided hers on the keys, his voice calm and patient. He always said, "When you play, don't think of the notes. Feel them." Her heart softened. Slowly, she lifted her hands and placed them on the piano. At first, she pressed one key, then another. The sound was clear and gentle. She took a breath, then started to play. The melody began quietly like a whisper, then grew with each note. It wasn't a song she planned. It was something her fingers remembered on their own, a piece she used to play long ago. The sound spread through the room like a soft wind. The noise from the tables faded. Conversation slowed, then stopped. Forks were set down. Glasses stopped clinking. People turned their heads, surprised by the beauty of what they were hearing. The melody had something different about it. It wasn't just skill. It had emotion. Every note carried something deep, something real. She played with her whole heart. Her eyes stayed closed, her fingers moving smoothly. The music told a story about love, loss, and the dreams she had locked away. The rhythm grew stronger, the sound rising and falling like waves. Some people leaned back in their chairs, lost in the sound. Others simply stared at her, unable to look away. The manager stood near the entrance, his mouth slightly open. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't just something soft, this was something special. Something powerful. The same woman who served food quietly every night was now the center of the room, commanding the attention of everyone present. When she finally finished, the last note hung in the air for a moment. Then came silence. It lasted a few seconds and long enough for her to wonder if she had made a mistake. But then a single person started clapping. Another joined. Soon the entire room was filled with applause. People stood up clapping loudly. Some even whistled. The sound of their appreciation was overwhelming. She looked around, eyes wide. Her hands were still trembling. She hadn't expected this. She had only wanted to help. But now everyone was looking at her not as a waitress but as a pianist. The manager walked up to her, still shocked. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, almost whispering. She smiled softly. "A long time ago." Throughout the night, guests came to her asking questions, praising her performance. One elderly man said her music reminded him of his late wife. A woman wiped tears from her eyes and told her it was the most beautiful thing she'd heard in years. Even the host of the event, a serious-looking businessman, came forward to shake her hand, thanking her for making the evening unforgettable. As the night went on, she returned to her regular duties, serving drinks and clearing plates, but something had changed. People who hadn't noticed her before now smiled warmly as she passed by. The same guests who once looked right through her now greeted her with respect. She didn't know how to react, so she just kept her gentle smile, though inside her heart was glowing. After the event ended and the guests left, the restaurant slowly grew quiet again. The staff began cleaning up, talking excitedly about what had happened. The manager approached her once more, still shaking his head in disbelief. "I'll be honest," he said. "I thought you were crazy for offering to play. But that was incredible. You made the night." She looked at the piano and said softly, "It felt like coming home." He nodded. "Well, if you ever want to play again, we won't stop you." When she left the restaurant that night, the streets were almost empty. The air was cool, the city lights shimmering on the wet pavement. She walked slowly, her shoes clicking softly against the ground. She thought about everything that had just happened. The fear, the music, the applause. It felt unreal, like a dream she didn't want to wake from. As she passed a small park, she sat on a bench and looked up at the sky. The stars were faint, hidden behind city lights, but she could still see a few of them twinkling. She whispered quietly, "I did it, Grandpa." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were happy ones. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel stuck. She had reminded herself, and everyone else, who she truly was. Not just a waitress, but someone who carried music in her soul. That night she went home tired but peaceful. Her hands still tingled from the piano keys. As she drifted to sleep, she couldn't stop smiling. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of something she had almost forgotten to believe in. Hope. The next morning, the restaurant buzzed with stories about the night before. Everyone was still talking about the waitress who had stunned the entire crowd with her piano playing. Some of the staff said it felt like they had witnessed something magical, something that would be remembered for a long time. Even the manager, who was usually strict and short-tempered, looked unusually pleased. He kept replaying the moment in his mind. How the quiet girl, the one he'd never heard speak loudly, had played like a true artist. When she arrived for her morning shift, Everyone turned to look at her. The cook smiled, the servers whispered to each other, and the host at the front desk greeted her with a small clap. She blushed, feeling shy under all the attention. She didn't like being the center of it, but at the same time she couldn't help but feel a little proud. She had done something brave, something she hadn't done in years. As the day went on, a few people from the night before came back to the restaurant, asking if the pianist was there. When they found out it was her, they smiled and asked to shake her hand. One woman said she hadn't been able to stop thinking about the music all night. Another man said the melody reminded him of his mother, who used to play piano when he was a child. The young waitress listened quietly, smiling politely, though inside she was deeply moved. Later that afternoon, the manager called her to his office. She walked in nervously, unsure of what to expect. He motioned for her to sit down. "You've caused quite a stir," he said, leaning back in his chair. "People can't stop talking about your performance. Even the family that hosted the dinner sent a message. They said your music made the evening unforgettable." She looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. He continued, "I didn't know you could play like that. You never said anything." She gave a small smile. "I guess I didn't think it mattered." "Well," he said with a half smile, "it mattered last night. You saved us, so thank you for that." He paused, then added, "Actually, there's something else. Someone wants to meet you." "Meet me?" she asked, surprised. "Yes, one of the guests from last night. He said he's a music producer. Apparently he was blown away by your performance. He left his card and asked if you'd call him." Her eyes widened. "A music producer?" She couldn't believe it. The manager handed her a small white card with a name and number printed neatly in gold letters. Her hand shook slightly as she held it. "I don't know what he wants," the manager said, "but you might want to find out." She nodded slowly, her heart racing. For the rest of the day she couldn't focus. The idea of calling someone like that scared her, but curiosity kept tugging at her mind. When her shift finally ended, she sat outside the restaurant with the card in her hand, staring at it. The sun was setting and the golden light made the world feel warm and calm. After a few minutes, she took a deep breath and called. The voice on the other end was kind and excited. The man introduced himself and said he'd been attending the charity dinner as a guest. He explained how deeply her performance had touched him and how he couldn't get the melody out of his mind. He told her he worked with artists and that he wanted to hear more of her music, maybe even record something. At first, she thought he was joking. But as he spoke, she realized he was serious. He asked if she could come to his studio later that week, just to play something for him. Her hands trembled as she said yes. The next few days were a blur. Between work and her usual chores, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She hadn't played seriously in years, and now someone wanted to hear her again. She dug out her old notebook where she used to write songs. Some of the pages were torn and the ink had faded, but seeing those notes brought back memories she had long buried. When the day came, she wore her simplest clothes but made sure she looked neat. She took the bus to the studio, her heart pounding with every stop. The building was tall and modern, with glass doors and shining floors. She felt out of place walking inside. But the receptionist smiled kindly and led her to a small recording room. The producer greeted her warmly. He remembered her from the restaurant and thanked her for coming. He asked her to sit at the piano in the corner and said, "Play something you love, anything." She hesitated for a moment, then let her fingers find the keys. The sound filled the room, gentle and full of feeling. It wasn't perfect, honey, she made small mistakes, but it was real. When she finished, he sat there quietly, then smiled. "You have something rare," he said. "You don't just play notes. You make people feel. That's what matters most." His words made her eyes sting with tears. No one had said something like that to her in years. He then asked if she would be interested in recording one of her pieces. She hesitated, unsure if she was ready, but he encouraged her. "Let's just see where it goes," he said gently. She agreed. Over the next few weeks, she began visiting the studio after her restaurant shifts. It wasn't easy. She still needed her job and the long hours were exhausting. But every time she sat at the piano, she felt alive again. She started to write new melodies inspired by her journey, by the people she met, and by the memory of her grandfather. The producer helped her polish her music, but never changed the heart of it. One evening, he told her he wanted to record her playing the same song she had performed at the restaurant. She smiled, remembering how scared she had been that night. Now she was still nervous, but also proud. She sat down, took a deep breath, and played it again, this time for the microphone instead of a crowd. The sound was pure and full of emotion. When she finished, even the studio staff clapped softly. A few days later, the producer uploaded a short clip of her performance online, with her permission. Neither of them expected what happened next. Within hours, people began sharing it. Comments poured in, thousands of them, from people all over the world. Some said the music made them cry. Others said it gave them peace. Everyone wanted to know who this mysterious pianist was. The video went viral. News outlets picked it up, calling her the waitress with the golden touch. People started visiting the restaurant just to see her, hoping she might play again. At first, she was overwhelmed. The sudden attention felt unreal. But when she saw how her music touched others, she realized it wasn't about fame. It was about connection. The manager couldn't believe the attention the restaurant was getting. Reporters started calling, asking for interviews. The owner, who rarely visited, showed up one morning just to thank her for bringing so much good attention to the place. They even suggested setting up a piano in the main hall permanently, so she could play a few times a week for guests. The first night she played again, the restaurant was full. Cameras clicked, phones recorded, but she didn't pay attention to any of that. She just played. The music flowed easily now, like it belonged there. When she finished, the applause was even louder than before. But what made her smile most wasn't the attention. It was seeing the quiet faces in the crowd who looked touched. The same way she used to be when she listened to others play. Her life began to change, little by little. The producer invited her to work on a small album. It was nothing grand at first, just simple recordings of her favorite songs, ones she had written from her heart. But each one carried her story, her pain, her hope. She didn't know where it would lead, but she was grateful for every moment. Sometimes, after long days in the studio or at the restaurant, she would sit by the piano and think about her journey. She remembered the nights when she thought her dreams were gone, the times she wiped that same piano after closing, wondering if she'd ever play again. Now here she was, living the very dream she thought she had lost. The people around her noticed the change. She smiled more, laughed more, and carried a quiet confidence that came from doing something she truly loved. Yet she remained humble. When people asked her about her success, she would always say, "It started with one night and one chance. I just didn't want to let fear stop me." Her story began to inspire others. Messages from strangers arrived every day, from people who had given up on their own dreams, saying her courage had reminded them to try again. Some were artists, some were ordinary workers, but all of them saw a bit of themselves in her. And though she still wore her apron and served tables when needed, there was something different in the way she carried herself now. The same girl who once thought no one noticed her was now touching hearts far beyond the walls of that restaurant. She had found her purpose again, and she knew this was only the beginning of something even greater. Months passed since that unforgettable night when the waitress had first stepped up to the piano. Life had changed more than she could have ever imagined. The restaurant where she once quietly worked had become known not just for its food but for the music that now filled its walls. People came from different parts of the city just to hear her play during the evenings. The regular customers who once barely noticed her now greeted her with smiles and warmth. The same piano she used to dust off every night had become the center of her world once again. Still, despite all the attention, she remained the same, humble, soft-spoken, and kind. Fame had never been something she wanted. What she wanted most was peace, and in music she found it. When her fingers touched the keys, the world faded away and she felt free, as if nothing else mattered. The small album she recorded with the producer started gaining attention online. It wasn't a big commercial success, but it reached people's hearts. Comments poured in from strangers who said her music helped them through hard days, comforted them during sleepless nights, or reminded them of something they'd lost. Each message she read made her emotional. She realized that her music wasn't just about her anymore. It was about connection, a bridge between her and people she'd never met. Sometimes, after closing hours, she stayed behind, sitting at the piano long after everyone else had gone home. She would play quietly for herself, the soft notes echoing through the empty restaurant. Those moments were her favorite. In the stillness, she felt closest to her grandfather, as if he were right there beside her, smiling the way he used to. One evening, as she finished her last song for the night, she noticed a familiar face sitting near the back of the restaurant. It was the music producer who had first discovered her. After the crowd thinned out, he approached her with a warm smile. "You've come a long way," he said. "Do you realize how many lives your music has touched?" She shook her head modestly. "I don't know. I just play what I feel," he laughed softly. "That's exactly why it works. People can feel that it's real." Then he paused, looking thoughtful. "There's something I've been meaning to ask. Would you be interested in performing live? Not here, but on a stage. We've had offers from a few event organizers who want to feature you." The thought made her nervous. "A real stage?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he replied. "A concert hall. People would come just to hear you play." She hesitated. The idea of standing before a large crowd terrified her. She had always been comfortable behind her serving tray, blending into the background. Even now, though she played in front of restaurant guests, the thought of an audience focused entirely on her felt overwhelming. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted. He smiled kindly. "You said the same thing before playing in that restaurant, remember? Sometimes the only way to know you're ready is to take the step anyway." His words stayed with her long after he left. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about how far she had come. There was a time when she had given up on music completely, believing her dream was gone. But then by chance, she had found herself sitting at a piano again, and everything changed. Maybe it was time to take another chance. A few weeks later, she agreed to perform at a small concert organized by the producer. It wasn't a huge event, but for her, it was monumental. The show was scheduled in a cozy concert hall that could seat about 200 people. As the day approached, she practiced tirelessly. Every morning before work and every night after her shift, she played until her fingers ached. Yet even with all the preparation, she couldn't shake the nervousness inside her. On the night of the concert, the hall was full. The air buzzed with quiet excitement. Backstage, she paced nervously, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear anything else. The producer came to check on her. "You'll be fine," he said gently. "Just play like you always do, from the heart." When it was finally time, she stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, and for a moment she felt blinded. But then she saw the piano, her comfort, her friend, standing quietly at the center. She took a deep breath and walked toward it. The audience waited, silent and curious. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat down. She looked at the keys, then closed her eyes for a moment, remembering her grandfather's words. "Don't think of the notes. Feel them." She exhaled slowly and began to play. The first notes were soft, delicate, like a whisper. Then the melody grew, spreading warmth through the hall. She played a mix of old pieces and her own compositions, each one carrying a piece of her story, her struggles, her hopes, her gratitude. As the music filled the room, her fear slowly melted away. She wasn't thinking about the audience anymore. She was simply sharing her heart. The audience sat still, captivated. Some people closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others watched her fingers move gracefully, amazed at how someone so modest could create such beauty. By the time she finished her final piece, tears glistened in more than a few eyes. When the last note faded, there was silence. The same kind of silence she had felt that first night at the restaurant. Then, as if on cue, the hall erupted in applause. People stood up, cheering and clapping. She looked around, overwhelmed. Her chest tightened with emotion, and for a moment she couldn't speak. All she could do was bow her head slightly, tears slipping down her cheeks. After the show, as the audience slowly left, several people came to her, thanking her for the music. One young woman told her she had been thinking about giving up on her dream of becoming a painter, but changed her mind after hearing the performance. Another man said the music reminded him to call his father after years of silence. Listening to them, she realized something powerful. Music had the ability to heal, to bring people together, to awaken something inside them. That realization filled her with quiet joy. In the weeks that followed, her story spread further. More event organizers reached out, offering her chances to perform. She didn't accept all of them. She wanted to take things slowly. She wasn't chasing fame. She wanted to make sure she never lost the feeling that made her play in the first place. Sometimes she still worked a few shifts at the restaurant. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to stay grounded. The staff treated her differently now, not just as a coworker but as a friend who had achieved something incredible. Guests would often recognize her, and every time she smiled and thanked them, she remembered how far she had come from the girl who used to quietly clean tables. One night, after closing, she sat alone at the piano again. The restaurant was silent, the only sound the gentle hum of the city outside. She started to play softly, the notes flowing effortlessly. As she played, she thought about her grandfather, her journey, and how everything had led her here. Her heart felt full. When she finished, she looked up and whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't clear who she was thanking. Maybe her grandfather, maybe life itself. But she meant it. Every struggle, every moment of doubt had brought her to this peace. Her life didn't suddenly turn into a fairy tale. There were still challenges, long days, self-doubt, moments of exhaustion. But she faced them with a strength she didn't know she had before. She had learned something precious, that sometimes the smallest act of courage, like stepping up to a piano in front of strangers, can change the entire course of a life. Years later, she would go on to perform in many more places. Her music reached audiences across cities, sometimes even on television or in online concerts. But no matter how big the stage became, she never forgot where it started. That quiet restaurant, that night when she decided to be brave. Every performance, she dedicated silently to her grandfather. She often imagined him sitting in the crowd, nodding proudly. And in every melody there was a piece of her old self, the girl who once thought her dreams were too far away. The world kept moving, and so did she, one song at a time. Her story wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about finding herself again, about remembering that even the simplest souls can hold something extraordinary inside them. And for those who ever felt unseen, her story was a reminder that sometimes all it takes is one moment of courage to turn an ordinary life into something unforgettable. And so, the waitress who once served others with quiet grace became the woman whose music served the world, not with words, but with the language of her heart carried gently through every note she played.